Imagine getting married tomorrow, but you didn't choose your partner. In fact, your parents sold you off when you were 12 to seal a business deal in your wedding night. Not romantic. Not private. It's a public performance where guests literally gather to watch you climb into bed. If you manage to survive the childbirth that almost certainly follows, good for you, because you've got maybe a 50-50 chance your spouse won't legally beat you to death before you turn 30. Welcome to medieval marriage, where till death do us part wasn't a poetic vow. It was a pretty accurate estimate. Think your dating life is a disaster? Try growing up in a world where your father could auction you off before you even learned to write your own name. Where your first night as a wife came with an audience. Where pregnancy was a gamble with your life. And where getting a divorce was about as realistic as launching yourself to the moon. By the time we're done here, you'll be ready to send thank you cards to every dating app on your phone. Compared to what medieval brides went through, even your messiest breakup looks like a happily ever after. Hit that subscribe button, because we're diving straight into the medieval marriage nightmare that makes modern relationships look like paradise. Sold before you could say, I do. Let's start with Margaret Beaufort, a girl who lived at the tail end of the medieval era and would eventually become the mother of the entire Tudor dynasty. Her story begins with something horrifying at just 6 years old. Her guardians married her off to John de la Pole in what was basically a glorified real estate deal. Margaret didn't consent, she didn't agree. She didn't even understand what marriage was. She was a child playing with dolls, while adults negotiated her future like property, and trust me, the adults knew exactly what they were doing. They were securing control of her enormous inheritance. 3 years later, when politics shifted, that marriage was tossed aside like a broken contract. No emotional fallout, no concern for the child involved, just, whoops, never mind. And Margaret was sold off again. Her new husband, Edmund Tudor, 24 years old. Margaret was 12. And here's where things get even darker. While medieval law technically allowed marriages at these ages, there was an unspoken societal rule. You weren't supposed to consummate the marriage until the girl was at least 14. Edmund Tudor wasn't interested in waiting. Within months of the wedding, 12-year-old Margaret was pregnant, a child carrying a child. And as horrific as that sounds, Margaret's story wasn't some isolated tragedy. Take Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France. In 1396, she was married off to King Richard II of England at the age of 6 years and 5 days. Her bridal chests, her trousseau, literally included her dolls and tiny silver furniture for them. She didn't bring jewels or gowns, he brought toys. The marriage contract had to spell out, in writing, that Richard couldn't consummate the marriage until she turned 12. Even medieval society, a world that thought bundling, testicle feasts, and public bedding ceremonies were normal, stared at this arrangement and went, yeah, this is pushing it. But here's what most people miss. These weren't tragic love stories. These were business deals. Cold, calculated transactions. Medieval parents weren't villains rubbing their hands together with evil laughter. They were participating in a system where children, especially girls, were economic assets. A daughter with land, titles, or inheritance was basically a walking jackpot. And in a world where wars, plagues, and political chaos could wipe out an entire fortune overnight, families scrambled to lock in alliances before disaster struck. So they married children off early, not because they were cruel, but because they lived in a society where marriage was a stock market, daughters were the currency, and the goal was to cash out before the market crashed. The most disturbing part, among the upper classes, this wasn't scandalous, it was normal, expected, socially acceptable. The church technically had rules about how young a marriage could be consummated, but when politics and money got involved, those rules suddenly became suggestions. Let's be honest, in medieval Europe, gold shouted louder than God. But here's an important reality check. While these extreme cases make jaw-dropping stories, most medieval people didn't marry this young. Peasants, craftsmen, merchants, they typically married in their late teens or early 20s. Child marriages were mainly a rich people problem, a side effect of having so much property, land, and political power that your daughter became a walking financial instrument. For girls like Margaret and Isabella, childhood ended the moment someone decided their inheritance mattered more than their humanity. And unfortunately for them, that was just the beginning. Their nightmare didn't end at the altar, it got worse the moment the wedding feast was over. Now let's dive into what happened after you said I do. Because medieval wedding nights came with such outrageous public rituals that modern reality TV would look classy in comparison. Welcome to the bedding ceremony, a tradition so invasive it makes today's wedding photographers look like discreet saints. Here's how it worked. After the feast, your friends, relatives, political allies, neighbors, and basically anyone who felt like participating would parade you to your bedroom or to drop you off. Oh no, to actively help prepare you for sex. The bride was taken to the chamber by the women, stripped, groomed, and tucked into bed, while older relatives gave helpful commentary about what was about to happen. Meanwhile, the men performed the exact same ritual with the groom. Once both parties were ready, they escorted him to the bed and made sure he physically got in with his new wife. Like chaperones making sure two teenagers didn't sneak out of a school dance. Then the priest stepped forward to bless the marriage bed for fertility, because of course he did. But the humiliation wasn't over. Next came the stalking ritual, a medieval target practice using underwear. The bridesmaids and groomsmen sat around the bed and hurled the couple's stockings at them. Whoever landed a direct hit was destined to be the next to marry, turning the new couple's first moments together into a chaotic carnival game. Romantic, right? But here's where things slide straight into please make it stop territory. In many cases, especially among the elite, witnesses didn't just escort the couple to bed. They stuck around to make sure the marriage was actually sealed. They didn't watch the act directly. Even medieval people had a shred of decency. But they would wait just outside the curtains, listening, waiting, and expecting proof that consummation had taken place. Take Margaret of York's marriage to Charles the Bold. In 1469, this political alliance was so massive that the bedding ceremony turned into a full-blown public event, with nobles documenting every moment like it was the medieval Oscars. The pressure was ridiculous, because if the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. And if it was annulled, the political deals attached to it collapsed instantly. Before you chalk all this up to rich people being bizarre, remember the logic behind it. In the medieval world, marriage was a legal contract, not a love story. Consummation is what made that contract binding. No consummation meant no legitimate marriage, no legal heirs, no inheritance rights, no diplomatic alliance, and sometimes no peace treaty. Basically, the entire political stability of nations depended on two strangers successfully having sex. No pressure, right? But here's the important reality check. While bedding ceremonies absolutely existed, they weren't as universal or as extreme as movies make them seem. Most of this intrusive nonsense was reserved for royalty and high nobility, where marriages had international consequences. For average medieval people, farmers, merchants, townsfolk, weddings were much simpler and far more private. You didn't have a crowd of nobles waiting to inspect their sheets. They had a small celebration, said their vows, and went home. It was the wealthy who had the misfortune of turning their wedding night into a public audit. Bedding ceremonies also weren't one size fits all. They varied wildly depending on where you lived and what century you were stuck in. In some regions, the ritual was more symbolic. Guests simply escorted the couple to the bedroom, offered blessings, and left them in peace. But in other places, especially parts of Scandinavia, public bedding wasn't just a custom. It was required by law to make the marriage legally valid. Imagine the government telling you your marriage doesn't count until half the village watches you climb into bed. Even royalty eventually had enough. King Charles I of England famously locked the door on his wedding night and flat out refused to participate in the ritual, and honestly is understandable. So the tradition clung on for another 100 years among various classes, long after kings realized they deserved at least one private moment in their lives. But the most disturbing impact was on child brides like Isabella of Valois. She went through this ritual at age 6, dolls included, fully aware that she was now legally someone's property, even if consummation wouldn't happen for years. This is the part of history classes that gets conveniently skipped. These ceremonies weren't just about tradition, they were about control, ownership, and public validation of something that should have been intensely private. If the wedding night sounded traumatic, just wait until you hear what came next. In medieval Europe, pregnancy wasn't a blessing, it was basically pulling the trigger in a biological game of Russian roulette. Let's return to Margaret Beaufort, because her story shows just how horrifying childbirth could be. Remember, Margaret was only 12 when Edmund Tudor got her pregnant. Then Edmund died of plague while she was 7 months along, leaving her a pregnant child to make a winter journey to Pembroke Castle. For a 13-year-old girl in that era, this was almost unimaginable. On January 28, 1457, Margaret went into labor. Her confessor, Bishop John Fisher, later wrote that it was a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. Translation: her body was so underdeveloped that everyone assumed she and the child were doomed. The birth was catastrophic. Margaret survived, but just barely, and the damage was permanent. Though she remarried twice, she never carried another child. One brutal childbirth had left the future mother of the Tudor dynasty sterile for life. And here's the horrifying part: Margaret wasn't unique. Her case is simply well recorded because she was important. Medieval childbirth statistics are nightmare fuel. Roughly 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or soon after. That means medieval pregnancy had a worse survival rate than base jumping without a parachute, and the medical care didn't help. Doctors used bloodletting during labor because nothing says healthy delivery like draining more blood from a woman who's already losing it. Birthing chairs were common to contraptions that were supposed to speed up delivery but often acted more like medieval torture devices. Even wealthy women weren't safe. Take Isabella of Aragon, dead at 18 after days of agonizing labor, despite having the best medical care available, which pretty much meant herbs, prayers, and hope. She suffered 4 days before finally succumbing. Childbirth was so dangerous that many women wrote their wills the moment they found out they were pregnant. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. What truly drives home the horror of medieval marriage is this: noble women were expected to get pregnant immediately and then stay pregnant for the rest of their lives. Menopause or death. whichever arrived first. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential women of the Middle Ages, survived 10 pregnancies, 10, and each one carried a real chance of killing her. For most noble women, 8 to 15 pregnancies weren't abnormally, they were expected. It was baby after baby after baby until their bodies finally gave out. The pressure was crushing. Producing heirs wasn't optional. It was their job description. A medieval wife who didn't conceive, especially one who didn't give birth to sons, was labeled a failure. Never mind that we now know male infertility is responsible for about half of all conception issues. Medieval medicine blamed women for everything. If anything went wrong in the marriage bed or the nursery, everyone pointed to the wife. And if a woman did survive years of childbirth, she didn't escape unharmed. Many were left with lifelong injuries, prolapsed organs, torn muscles, permanent incontinence, chronic pain. These weren't treated, they weren't even pitied. They were simply accepted as the price of being a wife. Even more heartbreaking, many of these women were still kids. Margaret Beaufort was 13 when she gave birth. Isabella of Aragon was 18 when childbirth killed her. Their bodies were still developing, and yet they were expected to immediately begin a cycle that would likely destroy them. Medieval marriage wasn't just about choosing a partner. It was about choosing someone who would be required to risk death repeatedly so the family line could continue. Saying "I do" meant signing up for a lifetime of medical Russian roulette, and the house always had the advantage. So let's say you survived being married off as a child, endured the public bedding ceremony, and lived through childbirth. Congratulations. Now you get to live with a husband who has the legal right to beat you, imprison you, or even kill you. And yes, this was absolutely allowed under medieval law. The doctrine of reasonable chastisement stated that a husband could physically discipline his wife for any behavior he thought inappropriate, and reasonable was defined so loosely it might as well not have existed. We have documented cases of men being completely cleared for beating their wives with sticks as long as the stick wasn't thicker than their thumb. That's where the phrase rule of thumb comes from, romantic, right? But nothing illustrates the brutality of medieval marriage laws more than Henry VIII. Henry lived right at the end of the medieval era and into the Renaissance, but he wielded medieval marriage laws like a weapon. If one of his wives failed to give him a male heir, he didn't settle for separation or annulment. He didn't even settle for divorce. He jumped straight to execution. Take Anne Boleyn, and she didn't produce the son. Henry demanded, and when he personally got bored of her, he had her charged with adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was basically non-existent, but that didn't matter. Under the laws he manipulated and twisted, a wife could be legally killed on accusations alone. A wife's adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal in the medieval mindset, it was considered treason against the crown, because it cast doubt on the legitimacy of potential heirs. Treason was a capital crime, and the punishment was death. That's how Anne Boleyn ended up on the scaffold on May 19, 1536, after a trial that was little more than a state-sponsored execution. The accusations were absurd: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. The charges were so ridiculous that even Henry's advisors struggled to make them sound remotely plausible, but plausibility wasn't required. The court didn't need real proof, they just needed enough legal smoke to justify removing a wife who had become politically inconvenient. Catherine Howard met the same fate. When Henry discovered her past relationships and suspected her of adultery, he wasted no time sending her to the executioner as well. She was only about 19, barely out of girlhood when she was beheaded. But here's the chilling truth. This wasn't Henry VIII being unusually monstrous. This was medieval marriage law functioning exactly the way it was built to function. Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, learned this the hard way. She was imprisoned, tortured, and publicly humiliated by her husband's political enemies with her husband's full support. Her crime being a political liability. In the medieval world, divorce wasn't merely difficult, it was practically unattainable. The Catholic Church controlled marriage, and they only granted annulments under extremely narrow conditions. To escape a marriage, you had to prove the union had never been valid in the first place, which usually meant proving it had never been consummated. This led to humiliating public investigations where women were subjected to physical examinations to confirm they were still virgins. And even if you somehow managed to prove non-consummation, the process could drag on for years and drain an entire fortune. Most people couldn't afford the cost financially or socially, so women stayed trapped in marriages where their husbands could legally beat them, legally force sex on them, legally confine them, legally control every part of their lives. Because the law was brutally clear, a married woman had no legal identity outside her husband. She wasn't a person. She was property. She couldn't own property, sign legal documents, or even speak in court without her husband's approval. If he chose to lock her in a tower for the rest of her life, that was entirely within his rights, and if he decided he wanted her dead. The law offered plenty of convenient loopholes. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or treason could be manufactured with ease, and medieval judges weren't exactly known for demanding evidence, especially when the accused was a woman who had become an inconvenience. The most chilling part: many of these women understood exactly what marriage meant, They knew they were surrendering every legal protection they had. They knew they were placing their safety, their futures, and their very lives into the hands of one man. But there were no alternatives. An unmarried woman had even fewer rights. Marriage wasn't a choice, it was survival. So when Henry VIII executed 2 of his wives, he wasn't breaking medieval law, he was following it. The entire system existed to give husbands absolute authority, including quite literally the power of life and death. If a wife couldn't produce heirs, or political value, or simply obedience, her only hope was that her husband was kinder than the law required him to be. Let's stop pretending medieval marriage was romantic. It was business cold, calculated business where the assets happened to be human beings. If you think modern relationships come with financial stress, medieval marriage operated on a level that makes prenuptial arguments look adorable. Enter the dowry system, a legally sanctioned drain on the bride's family, forcing them to pay the groom's family for the privilege of marrying their daughter off. And these weren't small tokens of appreciation. Many dowries equaled hundreds of thousands of modern dollars, sometimes more. Take Isabella d'Este, one of the most powerful women of the late medieval period. Her marriage negotiations dragged on for 3 years, handled like a high-stakes corporate merger. Multiple noble families entered a bidding war, each offering increasingly absurd sums to secure the political advantage of marrying into Isabella's house. Her dowry wasn't just money, it included jewels, estates, and long-term political obligations that would take decades to fulfill. But here's the twisted irony. The bride's family wasn't just paying to get rid of their daughter. They were buying something in return: a son-in-law's protection, connections, and social prestige. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about leveraging a daughter to strengthen the family brand. If you couldn't afford a respectable dowry, your daughter's future was doomed. She'd either remain unmarried, which meant poverty and social invisibility, or she'd be forced to marry far below her station, dragging the entire family's status down with her. Meanwhile, the groom's family wasn't accepting a bride out of kindness. They were making a calculated investment. They weren't gaining a wife, they were gaining a dowry, her family's political ties, and any inheritance she might someday receive. Medieval marriage was literally a business contract, where the bride was both the merchandise being traded and the payment used to close the deal. And as bad as this sounds for the bride's family, it was nothing compared to what happened to the bride herself. Once she married, every single thing she owned, including the dowry her parents sacrificed everything to provide, immediately became her husband's property. She went from being her father's possession to being her husband's possession, and she carried her own purchase price with her. But the financial nightmare didn't stop there. Medieval inheritance laws were intentionally designed to keep wealth locked in male hands. When a woman's husband died, she often lost everything. His property didn't go to her, it went to his male relatives. Widows were thrown into sudden poverty so often that many remarried as quickly as possible, not for companionship, but simply to survive. Some married 4 or 5 times, praying each new husband wouldn't die and leave them destitute again. Others ended up in convents not out of devotion, but because it was the only alternative to starving. A rare few women learned to outmaneuver this rigged system. Margaret Beaufort, despite nearly dying in childbirth at 13, eventually became one of the wealthiest women in England, by fiercely guarding her inheritance and choosing her later husbands with ruthless strategy. But she was the exception. Most women never had that chance. For the average medieval family, arranging a daughter's marriage was choosing between financial ruin and social disgrace. Some families plunged into crippling debt for a single dowry. Others had to accept marriages that offered no status, no opportunity, and no protection for their daughters. And the cruelest irony, even after bankrupting themselves, families had no guarantee their daughter would be safe or respected. Once the dowry was paid, the marriage sealed, and the paperwork signed, the bride's family had zero legal rights to intervene if the husband became violent, neglectful, or abusive. The money was gone. The daughter was legally absorbed into her husband's household, and the family was left with debts and no way to help her. This wasn't marriage. It was human trafficking with a priest present. Medieval couples weren't joining their lives. They were finalizing a transaction that treated women as both commodities and currency, and the price of entry into that system was so high it financially wrecked families for generations. Love, compatibility, happiness, those were luxuries reserved for people who could afford to ignore the economic reality. For everyone else, a daughter's marriage could either elevate the family or destroy it. Financially, romance was just another word for fiscal suicide. And speaking of death, let's get to the part medieval marriage excelled at: till death do us part, literally. Here's the ultimate medieval marriage plot twist. All the trauma, financial ruin, and legal oppression we've covered, you probably wouldn't deal with it for very long because medieval marriages came with a built-in expiration date: death. The average marriage lasted 15 to 20 years, not because couples fell out of love, but because one of them died. And usually, that someone was the wife, thanks to the childbirth roulette we talked about earlier. Not that husbands were thriving. Wars, plagues, and basic ignorance of hygiene meant men were dropping like flies too. Take the Black Death, the 14th century pandemic that wiped out 1/3 of Europe. Imagine spending years negotiating your daughter's extravagant dowry and political alliance, only for the groom and half the wedding party to die before the ceremony even started. Suddenly, all those careful financial strategies didn't matter, because your future son-in-law was now a corpse in a ditch. Here's where medieval logic gets brutally efficient. People adapted by treating marriage like a revolving door. Remarriage wasn't rude, disrespectful, or too soon, it was survival. Widows and widowers often remarried within months, sometimes within weeks of a spouse's death. Not because they were heartless, but because being single in medieval society was its own death sentence. Marriage meant protection, income, social status, and survival. Without it, you were vulnerable, impoverished, and legally powerless. Some medieval women became serial wives out of sheer survival. They'd marry, hope to live a few years without dying in childbirth, become widowed, and immediately start hunting for the next husband before their food, money, or shelter ran out. It was like a grim game of medieval musical chairs, and when the music stopped, whoever didn't have a spouse was doomed. The wealthy had a slight advantage. They could afford to stay single a bit longer, but even noble families felt the pressure. They treated marriage like risk management, often arranging backup spouses for their children in case the first one died. Some marriage contracts even included clauses for what would happen when, not if, one spouse died. Nothing captures the medieval mindset better than this. Wedding ceremonies included prayers not only for the couple's happiness, but for their souls after death. Priests blessed the marriage while simultaneously preparing everyone for the funeral that was probably coming sooner than later. The constant threat of death also created bizarre family situations. Some women outlived 3 or 4 husbands, accumulating wealth and power each time like medieval Black Widow investors. Others weren't so lucky. Every time a husband died, they lost everything and had to start again from zero. Children from these rapid-fire remarriages produced wildly tangled family trees. A single household might include half-siblings from the mother's first marriage, step-siblings from the father's second marriage, and no guarantee any of them would still be alive by next winter. Medieval record keepers basically became soap opera writers out of necessity. John married Mary, died in childbirth. John married Susan, died of plague. John married Margaret, outlived John, then married Thomas. The documents read like a never-ending tragedy. The psychological toll was enormous. Medieval people couldn't afford to become too emotionally attached to their spouses. The odds of losing them were simply too high. Marriage wasn't about romance. It was about survival, alliances, and staying alive long enough to raise an heir. Emotional connection was a luxury people simply couldn't risk. And yet, despite all this death, danger, and trauma, people kept marrying. They kept having children. They kept negotiating dowries, enduring public bedding ceremonies, surviving childbirth, roulette, and navigating laws that allowed husbands to beat or imprison them. Because in medieval society, even a dangerous, potentially deadly marriage was still safer than facing the world alone. When medieval couples said "till death do us part," they weren't being poetic. They were being absolutely literal. Death was the only guaranteed exit from marriage, and it usually arrived much sooner than anyone hoped. So there it is, the brutal truth of medieval marriage. Child brides sold like property. Wedding nights turned into public events. Childbirth that killed 1 in 3 women. Husbands with legal rights to beat or imprison their wives. Dowries that bankrupted families. And marriages so short-lived that trauma barely had time to settle in. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that I can swipe left on someone without my father negotiating a dowry payment behind my back. Because sometimes the best way to appreciate modern dating is to remember just how horrifying the alternative used to be. And if this dive into medieval marriage misery made you suddenly grateful for modern romance, or at least modern choices, share this video with someone who complains about dating today. Trust me, nothing fixes heartbreak faster than realizing what people used to live through in the name of love.